Okay, so real talk. The version of Helen Keller you were taught in school, sweet, inspirational, overcame incredible odds, yeah, that version is maybe 10% of the actual story. The real Helen Keller was investigated by the FBI. She helped build one of the most powerful legal organizations in American history. And I cannot stress this enough, millions of people alive right now genuinely believe she never existed at all. And here's the thing I want you to sit with for a second. You've heard the story. Deaf girl, blind girl, miracle teacher, overcomes everything, inspirational poster in the hallway. But nobody, literally nobody, tells you what happened after. Nobody tells you what she actually believed. Nobody tells you what the government thought of her. By the end of this video, you're going to know the complete story. And honestly, it's so much wilder than whatever you got in 6th grade. So, let's actually start at the end, because that's where it gets absolutely wild. It's September 14th, 1964. Helen Keller is 84 years old. President Lyndon B. Johnson is placing the Presidential Medal of Freedom around her neck in the White House, the highest civilian honor in the United States. And the crowd is applauding this living legend. But here's what almost nobody in that room was thinking about. Just a few decades earlier, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had her under active surveillance. Why? Because she was a self-declared socialist. Because she had spent decades speaking out against wars, inequality, child labor, and corporate power. That is the Helen Keller they don't teach. And that's what we're here for today. All right, let's build this thing properly from the ground up because context matters here. Helen Adams Keller was born on June 27, 1880, in Tuscumbia, Alabama. And here's the thing that most people actually don't know. She was born completely healthy. Perfect hearing, perfect vision. By 18 months, she'd already started saying her first words. Her parents described her as bright and curious and almost unusually perceptive for her age. She was happy. She was developing normally. And then, in February of 1882, when she was 19 months old, everything changed. In February 1882, Helen Keller got sick. And we're not talking about a typical toddler fever situation. This was serious. Doctors at the time called it, and I love this, brain fever, which is exactly as terrifying as it sounds. For days, she burned with a high fever while her parents took turns sitting at her bedside, certain she was going to die. And then, one morning, the fever broke. Just as suddenly and mysteriously as it had come, it was gone. Her mother, Kate, ran into the room, overwhelmed with relief. Her little girl had survived. But when Kate held a lamp up to Helen's eyes, Helen didn't blink, didn't react at all. The fever had taken something with it. The damage was done. Okay, so here is where the science gets genuinely incredible. Because for literally over 100 years, nobody actually knew what illness hit Helen Keller. Her own autobiography says the doctors weren't sure. The official diagnosis was, and again I quote, acute congestion of the stomach and brain. Super helpful, right? But then, in 2018, a pediatric infectious disease expert at the University of Michigan published the first ever comprehensive medical analysis of her case. And the conclusion? She almost certainly had bacterial meningitis, specifically meningococcal meningitis, caused by the bacterium Neisseria meningitidis. And the reason this matters? That bacterium had about a 60 to 70% fatality rate in 1882. Helen Keller, before she did anything else remarkable, survived a disease that killed most of the people it touched. So here's what meningococcal meningitis actually does to the body. It inflames the meninges, the protective membranes that wrap around the brain and spinal cord. And when that inflammation spreads and puts pressure on the auditory nerves and optic nerves, you can lose your hearing and your vision simultaneously. That's exactly what happened to Helen. Within days of the fever breaking, her world went completely dark and completely silent. She went from a laughing, curious, word-saying toddler to nothing. No sound, no light, no way to understand what was happening to her. Her mother, Kate, later said it felt like losing her daughter twice, once to the illness and once to the silence that followed it. Now, and I want to be really clear that I say this with complete respect, for the next 5 years after losing her sight and hearing, Helen Keller was essentially feral. And I'm not editorializing. That's basically how her own family described it. She was violent. She was angry. She threw tantrums that could last for hours. She'd bite people. She'd kick and pinch and scratch. She knocked out one of Anne Sullivan's teeth before they'd even known each other a week. She'd reach into other people's plates and grab whatever food she wanted. And look, of course she did. She was a child trapped in total darkness and silence, with no language, no way to ask for anything, no way to understand anything around her. She actually invented her own system of home signs. Researchers have identified over 60 distinct gestures she used to communicate, but she had no concept that things had names. That breakthrough hadn't happened yet. Her father, Captain Arthur Keller, was desperate. He'd read about a woman named Laura Bridgman, another deaf-blind woman who had actually been successfully educated years earlier at the Perkins School for the Blind in Boston. So he started making inquiries. He eventually got a meeting with Alexander Graham Bell. Yes, the Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone, who was deeply invested in deaf education because his own wife Mabel was deaf. Bell connected the Kellers directly to the Perkins School, and the Perkins School assigned their best candidate, a 20-year-old recent graduate named Anne Sullivan, to travel to Alabama and teach Helen Keller. What happened next changed everything we thought we knew about human learning. Okay, before we get to the most famous teaching moment in American history, I genuinely want to know what you think. Because this is a question that comes up every single time this story gets told. Drop it in the comments right now. Do you think you could have done what Anne Sullivan did? Like, seriously think about that. You've got a 6-year-old who is completely nonverbal, can't see anything, can't hear anything, responds to frustration with biting and kicking. Could you have gotten through? Let me know down below. All right, back to the story, because it gets good from here. So, Anne Sullivan shows up at the Keller family home on March 3, 1887. And here is the part of this story that absolutely nobody talks about. Anne Sullivan herself was nearly blind. As a child, she developed a severe eye infection called trachoma, a bacterial infection of the cornea, which was left completely untreated in the poverty-stricken orphanage where she grew up. The infection had severely damaged her vision. She'd undergone multiple painful surgeries trying to correct it, with only partial success. She could read, but had to squint and strain constantly. The woman the Perkins School sent to teach a blind girl was nearly blind herself. I don't know who needs to hear this, but sometimes the universe has a very specific sense of humor. Now, here is where this gets genuinely scientifically fascinating. Anne Sullivan's teaching approach was, frankly, revolutionary, and not just for its time. She completely ignored formal curriculum, no books, no classroom. Instead, she took Helen outside, into the garden, into the fields, down to the creek, and spelled words directly into Helen's hand using the manual finger alphabet, while simultaneously letting Helen touch and smell and taste the thing being named. She was building a tactile language system from scratch, and modern neuroscience completely validates what she was doing. Haptic learning, learning through touch, directly activates the somatosensory cortex, and research shows it can form more durable, long-term memory pathways than either auditory or visual learning alone. Anne Sullivan figured that out in 1887 by pure instinct. She was a neuroscientist who didn't know she was a neuroscientist. And then, about a month after Anne Sullivan arrived, comes April 5th, 1887, the most famous moment in the history of education. Helen and Annie are outside at the water pump in the yard. Annie pumps the handle. Cold water pours over Helen's hand, and at the same time, Annie spells W-A-T-E-R into Helen's other palm. She does it again. Water flows. W-A-T-E-R. Again. And then, something clicked. Helen's whole body went still for a moment. Then she erupted with excitement. She dropped to the ground and touched the earth and demanded Annie spell the word for it. She pointed at Annie and wanted her name too. She ran around the yard, touching everything in reach, demanding a word for every single thing. In the next few hours, she learned 30 new words, and in the 3 weeks after that single morning, she added more than 100 words to her vocabulary. The door had opened. Okay, we have to address something before we go any further, because there is a conspiracy theory, and I am completely serious, circulating on TikTok and social media right now, claiming that Helen Keller was fake, that she didn't exist, that a deaf-blind person simply could not have done what was claimed. Some people have pointed to her level of literacy and eloquence as evidence of fraud. And look, I genuinely understand the instinct, because what she accomplished does seem almost impossible. But here's the thing. The conspiracy theorists accidentally stumbled towards something. The real Helen Keller is almost unbelievable. They just got the reason completely wrong. She wasn't a fraud. She was something far more interesting and far more inconvenient than a fraud. Back to the timeline. Here is a fact that I genuinely believe is more impressive than almost anything else in this entire story. In 1900, Helen Keller enrolled at Radcliffe College, which was, effectively, Harvard University's coordinate college for women. And in 1904, she graduated, with honors. She was the first deaf-blind person in human history to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. Let that actually sink in for a moment. She was reading every assigned text in Braille, and Braille versions of books had to be created specifically for her because many simply didn't exist yet. Anne Sullivan sat beside her in every single lecture and spelled every word of every professor's speech directly into Helen's hand, in real time, for 4 years. No disability accommodations framework existed because that concept didn't exist yet. She just did it. But college wasn't the first big controversy. Let's go back to 1891, when Helen was just 11 years old. She wrote a short story called The Frost King, a charming fairy tale-style story about the origin of autumn leaf colors, and sent it as a birthday gift to Michael Anagnos, the director of the Perkins School. He loved it so much he published it in the school's alumni newsletter, and then someone noticed. The Frost King was remarkably, suspiciously similar to an existing story called The Frost Fairies, written years earlier by a woman named Margaret T. Canby. Not vaguely similar, almost passage for passage in places. Helen Keller, at age 11, was accused of plagiarism. National headlines, scandal. The story became front-page news across America. Here's the thing, and this is where the science comes back in. What Helen Keller almost certainly experienced is a real and well-documented psychological phenomenon called cryptomnesia. Cryptomnesia is when a genuine memory resurfaces in your mind, but without any tagging that identifies it as a memory, so your brain presents it to you as an original idea. It happens to everyone, by the way. You know that feeling when you come up with what seems like a genius idea, and then 2 days later realize you definitely heard it somewhere before? That's cryptomnesia. For Helen, whose entire experience of language and narrative came from what was spelled into her hand or read aloud to her, this wasn't just possible, it was almost inevitable. She was, in a very real sense, a perfect vessel for absorbed language. The Perkins School actually convened a formal tribunal over this. A committee of 8 people, 4 sighted, 4 blind, sat Helen Keller down and questioned her. There are accounts suggesting some of the questioning was intense, even harsh, for an 11-year-old girl. The vote came back deadlocked. 4 believed she'd plagiarized, 4 believed she hadn't. Director Anagnos broke the tie in Helen's favor and cleared her. But the damage was already done. Helen later wrote that the experience left her so terrified of expressing herself freely that she struggled with writing for years afterward, always afraid something in her words might have been absorbed from somewhere else. One of her fiercest public defenders through the whole ordeal? Mark Twain. Samuel Clemens himself, who called her, and I'm quoting directly here, the most marvelous person of her sex that has existed on this earth since Joan of Arc. Okay, second pattern interrupt because I have to talk about this. Helen Keller learned to speak out loud, with her actual voice. As in, she gave spoken public lectures, to audiences that could both see and hear. Now sit with that for a second. She was completely deaf. She had never heard any sound in her life that she could remember. She had no idea what her own voice sounded like. So, how do you learn to speak when you cannot hear? She learned by placing her fingertips on people's throats, on their lips, their jaw, the bridge of their nose, and feeling the vibrations and airflow and shapes of spoken words, then painstakingly mimicking what she felt. She worked specifically with a teacher named Sarah Fuller at the Horace Mann School for the Deaf in Boston, starting in 1890. Her speech was genuinely difficult for strangers to understand at first, but she gave public speeches for the rest of her life. A deaf woman, speaking out loud, to the world. Okay, now we get to the stuff they really don't teach. Because after graduating college, Helen Keller became one of the most politically radical public voices in America. In 1909, she joined the Socialist Party of America. In 1912, she went further and joined the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, known as the Wobblies, one of the most militant labor unions in American history. She publicly supported workers' rights, opposed child labor, advocated for women's suffrage and birth control, and wrote letters supporting the NAACP. And here's the thing that I personally love most about all of this. When newspapers that had spent years writing glowing profiles of the sweet blind girl from Alabama started criticizing her politics, one Alabama editor literally wrote that her radical views must be the result of her disabilities clouding her judgment. Helen Keller, who had by this point graduated from Harvard, wrote back, in print, and absolutely destroyed the argument. And yes, she absolutely ended up on J. Edgar Hoover's radar. The FBI maintained an active file on Helen Keller, flagging her as a suspected communist sympathizer and left-wing political agitator. This was part of the broader Red Scare and Cold War-era surveillance of activist figures across the political left. Think about that for just a moment. A woman who cannot see, cannot hear, who has spent her life communicating to the world through a system of fingerspelling and touch. The United States government considered her a sufficient political threat to monitor. And in 1964, the same year President Johnson placed the Presidential Medal of Freedom around her neck in the White House, her name was still in government files as a person of political concern. There is something almost perfectly, achingly American about that specific irony. In 1920, Helen Keller was one of the co-founders of the American Civil Liberties Union. I want you to let that sentence actually settle. The ACLU, which to this day litigates free speech cases, civil rights protections, reproductive rights, and constitutional freedoms across America, was co-founded by a woman who was deaf and blind, who had been born in Alabama in 1880, who learned to read by having words spelled into her palm. She co-founded it alongside Jane Addams, Crystal Eastman, Roger Baldwin, and a group of progressive activists who had watched the government suppress anti-war speech during World War I and said, "Enough." The woman your 6th grade teacher taught you about through a single story about a water pump helped build one of the most consequential legal organizations in American history. That's the real story. And she didn't stop there, not even close. Helen Keller traveled to 39 countries over the course of her lifetime, experiencing all of it through touch, smell, taste, and the hands of her companions who translated the world for her in real time. She met every sitting U.S. president, from Grover Cleveland to Lyndon B. Johnson. That's 13 presidents. She corresponded with Albert Einstein, Winston Churchill, and Charlie Chaplin. She wrote 12 books and dozens of essays. And perhaps most underappreciated of all, in 1907, she published a public campaign urging doctors to administer antiseptic eye drops to the eyes of every newborn baby, a simple preventative measure for neonatal conjunctivitis that at the time only a fraction of doctors were doing. Her advocacy helped push that practice into widespread adoption, and it is directly credited with preventing an enormous number of cases of preventable childhood blindness. A blind woman who helped the world see. Helen Keller died on June 1, 1968, 26 days before her 88th birthday, at her home in Easton, Connecticut, peacefully in her sleep. At her memorial service, Senator Lister Hill of Alabama, her home state, said that she had conquered more worlds than Alexander. And here is the honest truth I want to leave you with. The version of Helen Keller that gets taught in schools is real. The water pump happened. The breakthrough happened. The inspiration is genuine. But that version is maybe 10% of who she actually was. The real Helen Keller was messy and radical and controversial and brilliant and occasionally wrong and occasionally brilliantly, devastatingly right. She was a full human being, not a symbol. And she spent her entire life fighting to make sure the world understood the difference. So let me recap the full arc of this one human life, because I want you to actually feel the weight of it. A 19-month-old baby in Alabama survives a bacterial brain infection that killed 60 to 70% of the people it touched. She spends 5 years in total darkness and silence, with no language and no way to understand the world. A nearly blind teacher arrives, and in the span of a single morning at a water pump, builds the first bridge into her mind. She graduates from Harvard's Women's College with honors. She publishes a plagiarism scandal that could have silenced her forever and comes back stronger. She learns to speak without ever hearing sound. She joins the Socialist Party, then the IWW. She co-founds the ACLU. She gets surveilled by the FBI. She travels to 39 countries. She meets 13 presidents. She receives the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And the internet decides she was probably made up. That is the real story of Helen Keller, and now you know it. So the next time somebody tries to give you the 6th grade version of Helen Keller, the water pump story, the miracle teacher, the feel-good inspiration, you now have the full picture. And if you want to keep pulling on this thread, the next video goes somewhere equally unexpected. The real story of Anne Sullivan herself. Because, as it turns out, the woman who taught Helen Keller had a childhood that was, in some ways, just as brutal and just as remarkable. The story doesn't end here, it just changes rooms. See you there.